Yep.
Former Minnesota legislator who is currently seeking the Republican endorsement for Attorney General running this year in 2018. We're going to talk with him shortly. 651-989-5855 is the number to join us and to participate in our conversation, ask a question of our guest, Doug Wardlow, running for Attorney General. Brianne taking those calls and producing the show. So let's get straight to it, Mr. Wardlow. Let's start with this. I want to get into the personal stuff, who you are, why you're running, those types of questions. But I think where we need to start, just because of the context of your run for a particular office, is what is an attorney general and why should we care?
Right. Well, excellent question. And thanks for having me on, Walter. It's very good to be here. So the Attorney General is the top law enforcement officer in the state. The Attorney General is the top legal officer in the state. The Attorney General represents all state agencies and regulatory enforcement actions. The Attorney General does a whole bunch of different things, and it's a very important office. It's independent and autonomous from the governor and from the legislature. So we really should care about this office, and I like to talk about it in terms of what we should be doing with the Attorney General's office, because the Democrats that have had the office for nearly half a century haven't been using it properly.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that, and then we'll get into the particulars of your story and your candidacy. But, when you talk about the way that the Democrats have been utilizing the Attorney General's office, it's important to understand that they've had control of this for a very long time. I mean, does 40 years sound too long?
46 years.
46
So the last
years.
Republican Attorney General was Doug Head, who was elected in 1966. And served for one term, 4 years.
And so naturally, when one party has that type of control for that length of time, it becomes an institution in its own right that's characterized by that party and that party's priorities. So get into describing some of the ways in which they've chosen to utilize this office as opposed to how, in your view, it ought to be.
So what Lori Swanson has done last 12 years, then Mike Hatch before her, they have basically, first of all, gutted the criminal law division of the office in favor of other things that they find more politically useful. So there aren't many attorneys left doing the criminal law work at the Attorney General's office, and that's really detrimental to the public safety of everybody in Minnesota, because our county attorneys, they don't have the backing that they should be getting from the Attorney General's office on difficult prosecutions, felony criminal appeals. The Attorney General's office isn't handling as many of those as they should be, and so then that falls on our county attorneys. And that just means our prosecutors, our frontline prosecutors, are overburdened, and they need help. And we have rising crime rates in Minneapolis and St. Paul in particular, but around the state. And the Attorney General's office isn't providing any leadership, and they should be providing leadership. They should be coordinating with law enforcement and backing up the county attorneys. They're just not doing any of that. So we're going to depoliticize the office, and we're going to move resources back to the criminal law division so we can keep Minnesotans safe.
So for longtime listeners to the program, you're familiar with the concept of passive tyranny that I talk about. And usually when we talk about this, it's in the context of something like the heckler's veto, of people showing up to shout down a speaker or whatever the case may be, like when Ben Shapiro came to town. And the idea is that government has an obligation to fulfill a certain role, an obligation to protect your rights. And there's two ways in which they can be tyrannical. One is the kind of, cinematic, stereotypical goose-stepping, boot on your face type situation. That doesn't happen too often, but what's very common is passive tyranny. That's when they decide that they're just simply not going to do their job, and they're going to let somebody else terrorize you. They're going to let somebody else engage in tyranny, and that's basically what you're talking about here with the unwillingness to engage in the job as it's supposed to be executed.
That's right, and it goes beyond just criminal law. So one of the key issues of the campaign, and one of the key things that really led me into this race is the need to protect our fundamental liberties, our fundamental constitutional rights, and that includes religious liberty and free speech, rights of conscience, Second Amendment, all of our important fundamental constitutional rights. The Attorney General's office, has the power to appear in any lawsuit whenever the Attorney General deems it's in the best interest of the state to do so. So the Attorney General can actively protect our rights. Lori Swanson's office doesn't do that, just doesn't do that. What they do is they focus on consumer fraud, and they go after companies, and I think they often harass businesses in Minnesota, and they have what seems to be a political agenda. And that's where they focus. If it's not something that's politically useful for Lori Swanson and her folks, then they're not going to do it. That's the word I've heard.
We're talking to Doug Wardlow, who's seeking the Republican endorsement for Attorney General here in the state of Minnesota. You can find out more about his campaign at DougWardlowAG.com. Your last name, Wardlow, spelled WARDLOW. That's DougWardlowAG.com. So tell us a little bit about you, Doug Wardlow. What do we need to know about who this guy is who's in my studio, and why are you seeking this particular office?
Right, and right now I'm the only Republican in the race, so we're sailing towards the endorsement, and we've got a really good chance here to unseat the Democrat for the first time in a very long time. So very excited about that. My background: I grew up in Eagan, and I'm now in Prior Lake. But I grew up in Eagan, and I served a term in the state house. I was a private practice litigator for a number of years at Parker Rosen here in town. Also at Skadden Arps for a couple of years out in Washington, D.C., doing international trade litigation under Bob Lighthizer, who's now the president's U.S. trade representative. And so that's sort of my litigation background. Did a lot of business litigation, eminent domain litigation. And then for the last several years, I've been with Alliance Defending Freedom, which is a nonprofit Christian law firm out of Scottsdale, Arizona. And I still do work with them now, but we focus on rights, including religious liberty, and then also rights of conscience, free speech, those kinds of cases all across the country. And religious liberty is so critically important. There are many cases, here in Minnesota and in other states that I'm working on right now that demonstrate how our religious liberty in particular is under attack, and so is our free speech. For example, look at California, a case that was argued before the Supreme Court just this week. NIFLA versus Becerra. So Xavier Becerra is the California Attorney General. Mm-hmm. And NIFLA stands for the National Institute of Family and Life Advocates, and they run pregnancy centers, pro-life pregnancy centers in California, right? And so what Alliance Defending Freedom is arguing to the court is that a California law that requires these pro-life pregnancy centers to basically advertise for abortions elsewhere is unconstitutional under the First Amendment.
And even Sonia Sotomayor agreed that this is ridiculous. Yes, the
judges, including some of the most liberal, seem to be they were very critical of the state, right? Sure. And so you see right there the case title, right? NIFLA versus Becerra. There's the Attorney General of California. The Attorney General's race is so important because the Attorney General is also the one that defends state laws, or in the case of laws that are unconstitutional or clearly unconstitutional, the Attorney General can do something about that too. But in this case, free speech is under attack and freedom of religion is under attack. What does the First Amendment mean if it doesn't mean that if it doesn't prevent the government from basically telling you that you need to spread a message that contradicts your fundamental beliefs, right? So religious liberty is under attack. And by the way, as long as we're talking about religious liberty, we have a fundraiser coming up on Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, March 28th, and that's in Arden Hills at North Heights Lutheran Church. And it's at 6 o'clock, and we're having Dr. Peter Scare, who's a professor at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana, come in, and he'll be talking about religious liberty, and I'll be talking about religious liberty and my cases involving religious liberty that I've been working on for quite some time. And it'll be a good evening rallying in defense of our fundamental freedoms and raising some money for the campaign as well. And you can reserve tickets online on the website, DougWardlowAG.com.
And we'll give those details again as we continue with our conversation with Doug Wardlow, who is seeking the Republican endorsement for Attorney General here in the state of Minnesota. Let's take a call, if you don't mind, Mr. Wardlow, from
Absolutely.
Zach in Lino Lakes, a regular caller of the program. Welcome.
So I guess, is it okay if I ask a couple questions? I'll try to make them quick.
Sure.
All right. So first question. I know a farmer. His farm got lost its organic cert because of spray drift. So what ultimately is that issue about? What would you do as an attorney general as a result of what the issue is about?
He lost. I'm sorry. So explain exactly what happened.
So yeah, he is an organic farmer, but neighbors are not organic and stuff, and they sprayed with chemicals that and that spray drift cost him his organic cert for a while.
I see. So that could be that could be a private lawsuit, perhaps. There could be some kind of property claim or tort claim there. I'm not sure. Yeah. Negligence kind of claim. I don't know that it's something that the Attorney General will be involved in. I'm not sure that unless there's some kind of regulatory issue there or state law involved. Is there?
Well, I think so, but like ultimately, what do you think? What do you think the issue is about? Like, what's the root issue behind pollution, for instance?
Zach is getting to the philosophy that underlies, an issue like that, where you're dealing with it. Like, why are torts even a thing? Is basically.
Oh, okay, yes, I see what you're saying. Yes, well, torts are a thing because we believe that there are certain duties that we owe to one another, right, with respect to our rights and with respect to property. And when those duties are violated, there should be some kind of civil remedy for those violations in most cases, right? You can't obviously fix all wrongs don't deserve a remedy, but a lot of them do. And so that's what tort law has developed to provide outside of contracts.
Yeah, I mean, I do think like pollution ultimately is an issue of property rights, and like and one thing that I would want to see in an attorney general is not somebody who necessarily ignores the pollution. I don't want them. Don't get me wrong. I don't want them to like to just go with the environmentalists by any means. But like if they were treating it like an issue of property rights, I'd be more willing to vote for somebody like that.
Well, pollution can be an issue of property rights. It really depends, right? So if you have a major polluter who's violating a duty or a regulation, or is doing something that's completely unreasonable and negligent and is damaging nearby property owners, there may be a civil suit there, but it's not necessarily something where the government would get involved. That sounds like a situation where you might have a remedy in a court of law between two private parties.
Yeah, I mean, like, if nobody is complaining about it, I don't like it when, like, Lori Swanson goes and says, oh, you gotta stop dumping because we say so, if nobody else is complaining about it, That's the kind of thing I don't like seeing, of course.
Right. And, there's an issue in Minnesota with discharge permits for wastewater treatment facilities and other industrial discharge, where the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has set limits that are very low, so that dischargers need to actually, something like 1 parts per billion, something like that. I don't know what the numbers are, but it's far, 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 far below the bodies of water that the discharge is going into, which could be arbitrary and capricious, that kind of thing.
You need to have a victim before you can have a crime. I appreciate your call as always, Zach. We do have to go to a break. We're talking with Doug Wardlow, a candidate seeking the Republican endorsement for Attorney General here in the state of Minnesota this year. You can find out more about his campaign at DougWardlowAG.com. Wardlow is spelled WARDLOW, just like it sounds, and then AG for Attorney General, DougWardlowAG.com. Closing argument. My name's Walter Hudson. 651-989-5855 is the number to join our conversation. Twin Cities News Talk, AM 1130, 103.5 FM, TwinCitiesNewsTalk.com.
Check out the on.
Doug Wardlow in studio with us tonight, candidate for Attorney General here in the state of Minnesota, running this year. You'll have the opportunity to support him if you happen to be a Republican delegate moving through the convention system. You'll definitely get an opportunity to weigh in on his candidacy through that process. And if all goes according to his plan, you'll get the opportunity to support him in the general election in November. So we'll look forward to that. 651-989-5855 is the number to join us. Closing argument. My name's Walter Hudson. Twin Cities News Talk, AM 1130, 103.5 FM. So, Mr. Wardlow, I want to talk about this case, one of these most recent cases you've been working on. There's been a number of them, but you mentioned your background in working for, I forget the name of the organization off the top of my head.
I work with Alliance Defending Freedom as an allied attorney. Yeah.
Alliance Defending Freedom, which one of their focuses, as I understand it, is religious liberty and the notion that people basically ought to be able to act upon their own conscience in determining the nature of their own relationships, which you wouldn't think is particularly controversial.
It's a fundamental kind of freedom that's sort of central to America's founding.
You would think, but apparently not everybody agrees with that notion. There's a case out of Garden City, Michigan, which, as a little bit of show trivia for you, is one of my former towns that I lived in as a child. We had a home in Garden City for a number of years, right before we moved to Minnesota. And there was a funeral director down there who got into some trouble over an employment issue. So tell us about this.
Yeah, so this is EEOC versus Harris Funeral Homes, and I represent, along with Alliance Defending Freedom, Harris Funeral Homes. And so Harris Funeral Homes is a family-owned business. The owner's name is Tom Rost, and he's a devout Christian. And he runs his business according to his deeply held religious beliefs, his Christian faith. And that includes his belief that a person's sex is an immutable God-given gift. Now, he had a funeral director on staff. And this gentleman one day decided that he was going to go on vacation, and he told Mr. Rost that when he came back from his vacation, he would no longer be a he, but it would be a she, and he would dress as a woman on the job as a funeral director while interacting with, clients of the funeral home. And of course, funeral homes engage in a very sensitive business.
Right.
And Mr. Ross sees the business as a ministry that he's called to care for those who are grieving the loss of loved ones.
Right.
And so this conflicted with Mr. Ross' religious beliefs in a few different ways, right? Because everybody at the funeral home that deals with the public, in particular funeral directors, has to wear a particular uniform. And it's a conservative kind of suit. And it's, there's one for males and one for females. And so there's a dress code. And that's to make sure that the proper care is given to grieving families. And the employee, Mr. Stevens, he basically stated his intent to violate that dress code.
Sure. Right.
And so he was discharged. Mm-hmm. And the EEOC got wind of this. Well, actually, Stevens filed a complaint of sex discrimination with the EEOC, alleging that Title VII, which bars employment discrimination based on sex, also covers transgender, gender identity, and those kinds of things, which it doesn't and shouldn't.
I was just going to ask. I don't recall it having anything whatsoever to do with
It's not in there. It's not in the law, right? So this is the EEOC, and then the ACLU represents Mr. Stevens. They intervened in the case on appeal. We won at the district court level, and under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, because the court said that basically what the EEOC was trying to do here by enforcing Title VII significantly burdened Mr. Ross' religious exercise, and there was no legitimate government interest to support that, and therefore under RFRA, it wasn't allowed. Now we went up to the Sixth Circuit, and the EEOC appealed, and we drew a panel of 3 judges, and we got some judges that are a little bit further left, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, on appeal, we lost the appeal. And so now we are considering what to do next, and what next steps are, whether to appeal that or what the next steps are going to be. But this is a very important case because it's all about, what kind of religious freedom do you have? And actually, it's interesting. It's the intersection of not just religious liberty, but also economic liberty, because you've got here a guy that's trying to run a business according to his beliefs, and then religious liberty comes in too. So it's a very important case. What matters more under our U.S. Constitution? And then there's religious liberty, or basically affirming this person's gender identity, which is not something that Title VII requires an employer to do at all.
Right.
And so it's about, should the courts be the ones to rewrite Title VII, or should that be a job for Congress?
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating to me because, I understand as a lawyer, you have to go by things like precedent and the letter of the law and the intent of the legislators when they crafted it and what have you. I like to start, and I know this isn't the legal process, but I like to start with the underlying moral principles involved. And when we talk so much about religious liberty, all religious liberty is a particular sidebar or a particular manifestation of the freedom of conscience.
That's exactly right.
The ability to determine how you are going to live. And when you put it in those terms, it becomes very clear very quickly that other people don't get to tell you how to live because they don't own you. We did something about slavery quite some time ago. It was pretty definitive. And so this notion that in the name of, whatever given cultural agenda somebody has, you don't get to decide what relationships you enter into on what terms should be something that's offensive to all Americans.
Yes, I agree. That's exactly right. And it's a pernicious thing, right? When you have the government basically telling a business what kind of relationships they can enter into and advancing a particular social agenda at the expense of economic liberty and religious liberty. And like you said, they're just different species of just a fundamental ability and freedom to live your life according to your conscience as you see fit.
Let's get a question in here from Bob in Minneapolis. You're talking with Doug Wardlow, who's seeking the Republican endorsement for Attorney General.
Hi, Mr. Wardlow. Pleasure to speak with you this evening. I got to give a shout out to my son Rory, who's listening with walking pneumonia tonight, but he's a fan of the show. So, Rory, hope you're listening.
We appreciate him listening.
Mr. Wardlow, I love. First of all, I love the word you just used, pernicious, and that is a slow way of taking away our freedoms in the context that you used. Absolutely great word. I could not agree with you more on the religious freedom. Mr. Wardlow, last week I was picked up for a warrant, and I spent 3 days in Ramsey County Jail. It was a bad experience. And what I saw around me was a lot of people without rehabilitation. Mm-hmm. It was all about retribution or keeping you away from society. What can you do as Attorney General to help people within our jail system get back to rehabilitate, to make them better? Because between the food and the conditions within Ramsey County Jail, and I would love this as you as running for office. I would love it if you could spend an afternoon or a night in Ramsey County Jail to experience that.
That's
see a lot of
an interesting
that have
idea.
No chance through our system to better themselves. Mm-hmm. It is 20 hours in your jail cell, and I was guilty of a DUI. And so I did my 3 days in there. But I'm thinking, people that are in here right now, how do they get better? As Attorney General, what could we do to rehabilitate people rather than just incarcerating and putting us, I'm one of them, back out on the streets?
All right. I appreciate the call, Bob. Thanks for giving us that question. We're going to let Doug Wardlow percolate on it for a commercial break because it's that time in our show. Closing argument. My name's Walter Hudson, Twin Cities News Talk, AM 1130, 103.5 FM, 651-989-5855. And we'll come back with the response to the prison system and potential rehabilitation from Attorney General candidate Doug Wardlow. TwinCitiesNewsTalk.com.
iHeartRadio.
This one of those nights, one of those interviews, and one of those guests where the conversation between segments off the air is as interesting, if not more so, than the conversation we're having on the air. Doug Wardlow is our guest in studio tonight. He's a candidate for Attorney General seeking the Republican endorsement. Closing argument. My name's Walter Hudson, Twin Cities News Talk, AM 1130, 103.5 FM. TwinCitiesNewsTalk.com and your iHeartRadio app. 2 ways to stream the program. We are here 9 to 11 weeknights. It's great having you with us. You can catch up on past shows by searching for Closing Argument in your iHeartRadio app. You can join our conversation, ask a question of Mr. Wardlow, 651-989-5855. Brian taking those calls and producing the show. So, we've been talking an awful lot about religious liberty because that happens to be a focus of your work with the Alliance Defending Freedom. Did I get it right? Mm-hmm. And it's obviously when you work on something like that for a period of time, as you have, it becomes something of a personal passion. And you have an event that's coming up here in Minnesota locally that has to do with that, and you got a special guest. Tell us more about that.
Yes, so we're having a fundraiser, a dinner that's going to be focusing on religious liberty and the current threats in America and in Minnesota toward religious liberty and what we need to do to defend our first freedom and our fundamental freedoms in general. And that is a dinner at North Heights Lutheran Church. It's not affiliated with the church, of course, but the dinner is entitled Defending Faith and Freedom Dinner. It's a fundraiser for the Doug Wardlow for Attorney General campaign. And we're going to have Dr. Peter Scare come in from Fort Wayne, Indiana. He's a professor at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, and he is a very popular speaker on religious liberty and related issues. So we'll have him, and I'll be there talking about cases that I've worked on impacting religious liberty around the country, including here in Minnesota. So it'll be a great evening. You can get tickets online at DougWardlowAG.com. And it's going to be a fantastic dinner, March 28th, this coming Wednesday.
Yep, I'm looking at the page where you can get those tickets right now. Again, DougWardlowAG.com. So you had a commentary that you submitted to the Star Tribune just a couple of months ago regarding sex trafficking, and your headline was "Keep Focus on Sex Trafficking Beyond the Super Bowl." Tell us about that. You know, there was, I recall, and the listeners may as well, there was this attention that people paid towards the notion of sex trafficking during the Super Bowl. I can't immediately recall what that connection was, why we were attaching the two. But talk a little bit about why this was something you felt you had to write at the Star Tribune.
Well, absolutely. So the Super Bowl is an event where it's sort of a magnet for sex trafficking, and it is, which is really quite a terrible thing, and it's a scourge across our country and here in Minnesota. And unfortunately, the Democrats in the Attorney General's office have not done too much about it. They haven't really provided the leadership, and they have been de-emphasizing criminal law in general, and not backing up our county attorneys or providing any leadership on fighting sex trafficking. It's such a significant problem. Now, the Super Bowl comes, and we see a spike in sex trafficking levels. And then what happens is when the Super Bowl leaves, the levels fall back down, but not as far back down to where they were. So you get this kind of permanent bump.
Sure.
And so that's why it's so important to continue to focus on fighting the evil of sex trafficking post Super Bowl, and then so we were trying to use the Super Bowl to highlight the problem.
Right.
And then try to deal with it. And that'll be a major issue in this campaign. And then when I win the Attorney General's race, we're going to actually do something about sex trafficking. We're going to move resources back to the criminal law division so that our county attorneys can prosecute and investigate and do what they need to do. We're going to work with law enforcement, provide some leadership there, and just put resources on the problem and make it a priority, because it hasn't been.
Now, that sounds like something that would just be universally lauded and appreciated by everyone. How was your commentary received?
Well, Lori Swanson, our current Attorney General, and Mike Hatch, the Attorney General before Lori Swanson, were quite defensive. And but they really don't have too much that they can say, because they didn't do too much about the problem. And they have gutted the criminal law division of the office. They have. So
I imagine in the course of your campaign, and even prior to announcing your candidacy, you've had occasion to talk to a lot of these county attorneys that you've been referring to. Can you share any anecdotes or paraphrase some thoughts that you've received from them regarding this lack of action from the Attorney General's office?
Yes, indeed. So in 2012, for example, there was a complicated double murder case up in Morrison County, Little Falls. And the county attorney there didn't know how to handle it, didn't have the expertise. So the procedure is to ask the Attorney General's office to come in and either provide support or take over the prosecution. So that request was made of Lori Swanson's office, and she said no. Just flat out no. And then they had to scramble to find another county attorney to come in and help. And that should never happen. That should never happen. So, and from what I'm hearing from various county attorneys, that's happening quite a bit.
Yeah.
They're just not getting support. They're having to handle felony criminal appeals. They're having to handle difficult cases that they don't really have the expertise to handle, and they're just not getting the help that they need. And that puts Minnesotans at risk. That impacts public safety.
Yeah, I'm trying to formulate an analogy that makes sense, but I the closest thing that comes to mind is if you had a sheriff's department somewhere that was asking the state patrol for backup or help with something that was relevant to what the state patrol does, and the state patrol just said, no, we're not going to do that.
Yeah, exactly.
We're too busy with our other political activism.
Right.
Us,
we're too busy with our consumer fraud stuff we can get in the front page of the Star Tribune and say we're suing this or that company for whatever.
Right. Before we went to our last break, we had a call from Bob, who asked a question regarding the state of our criminal justice system, and particularly how prisons work and what have you. It was a very specific policy question geared toward how we can rehabilitate people. I'd like your thoughts on that, but also on the role of the Attorney General in a policy question like that.
Right. So first of all, rehabilitation is very important. We want to try to rehabilitate people and get them back into society so they can be functioning members of society who are following the law. That's just a rule of law and order kind of thing we need to do. Now, it is more of a policy question, so the Attorney General's office doesn't impact it as directly as do legislators and other policymakers. Unfortunately, in our current administrative state kind of environment, a lot of times the policymakers aren't even elected. And there's something the Attorney General can do about that too. We fight the administrative state. The Attorney General gets to give a thumbs up or thumbs down to all rules and regulations that state agencies put out. And the Attorney General actually represents all state agencies in regulatory enforcement actions, so we can lift the burden of regulations off of job creators and individuals and really push back at the administrative state with the Attorney General's office. And the Attorney General should be doing that, and they're not doing that right now. So that's very exciting too. But that's a little bit of an aside. Back to the question. So rehabilitation is very important, but so is incapacitation. Getting people off the street, criminals and violent offenders off the street, and then there's the other element of criminal punishment, which is just the justice element. That if there's a wrong, there needs to be some kind of punishment. Right. So those are the three things: rehabilitation, retributive justice, and then incapacitation. And you need to make sure all of those three components are in place. Now, it would be good for the Attorney General to put more emphasis onto criminal law and then provide more resources to county attorneys and law enforcement and back them up. And then they would be able to handle situations in the jails and perhaps help on the rehabilitation side a little bit more. So that's one way the Attorney General could impact that problem. But generally speaking, that's a policy question. And the Attorney General's office is about enforcing the law, standing up for the rule of law, enforcing the law, standing up for our constitutional rights. It shouldn't be overly political. The only reason it's political right now is because we have one party and one set of folks in the Attorney General's office that view the rule of law basically as a political kind of thing. And that's really unfortunate. They use the office for political purposes, and they should not be doing that. But so my campaign is about standing up for what should be uncontroversial principles, namely that the rule of law is important, the constitutional rights are important, and that we should be keeping people safe, and that we should be making sure that our elected representatives are writing the laws that impact us, lifting the burden of regulatory state, and those kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, it really is, again, using the analogy of like a county sheriff, which is also an elected profession dealing with the enforcement of the law. If you had a sheriff who you elected and just he wasn't responding to anything, like his department was structured in such a way where they weren't doing their basic job, but they were all out there, having engaged in public relations activities to try to make themselves look good, but they weren't actually doing their job, that would be a significant problem. And that's basically what we're looking at. Right. With the Attorney General's office. A lot of press conferences, a lot of white papers. Right.
And that's
they're
about
a think tank over there. At the Attorney General's
basically.
office.
Yep.
When we come back, I want to ask you about whether or not there is a rightful role for consumer protection and some of these other things
yes, there is.
That the Attorney General has been doing under Democrats for the past 46 years. 651-989-5855 for your last opportunity to get in a question or comment for Doug Wardlow, who's running for Attorney General here in the state of Minnesota, seeking the Republican endorsement. Closing argument. My name's Walter Hudson, Twin Cities News Talk, AM 1130, 103.5 FM, TwinCitiesNewsTalk.com.
Hey, it's Drew here, inviting you.
Twin Cities News Talk, AM 1130, 103.5 FM, Closing Argument. My name's Walter Hudson. Joined in studio tonight by Doug Wardlow, who is a candidate for Attorney General seeking the Republican endorsement. 651-989-5855 is the number to join us. You can find out more about his candidacy at DougWardlowAG.com. And you can also look into an event he's got coming up on the 28th, which I believe is next week, correct? Yeah, on Wednesday. Defending Faith and Freedom dinner. You're going to have Dr. Peter Scare. Is that how it's pronounced?
That's right, yep.
A very popular speaker out of Fort Worth, Indiana, who's going to address rapidly growing concerns about religious liberty and freedom in Minnesota and around America. And, of course, our guest, Doug Wardlow, will be speaking as well. And sounds like a great opportunity for folks to engage in. And, again, you can find out more about that at DougWardlowAG.com. In our last segment with you here tonight, Doug, I wanted to ask you about the way in which the Democrats have utilized the office of Attorney General during the 46 years that they've held exclusive control of it. You've mentioned the fact throughout our discussion this evening that they've largely gutted the criminal law portion of that office, and that they focused very much on things like consumer protection, and particularly cases that push forward the social agenda of the Democrats and make the Democratic Party look good, and that make the attorney generals look good, so that they can set themselves up for runs for governor or whatever the case may be. Now, that's me talking. You haven't said that, but that's what they're doing. Right?
That's what they're doing.
That's definitely what they're doing. But so the question I want to ask you is there a rightful role for consumer protection from the Attorney General's office?
Absolutely there is. And that's because the legislature has passed a number of consumer fraud statutes that make certain things illegal, and then they make the Attorney General the agent of the government that enforces those laws. So enforcing our consumer fraud statutes is a very important thing, and the Attorney General should be doing that. So there's two problems with the way the Democrats and Lori Swanson have been doing it. First of all, they have done that to the exclusion of everything else that they should be doing. Right, so they've gutted the criminal law division. They aren't handling a lot of their other responsibilities, and so that's problem number one. So we need to move the resources around and make sure we're not forgetting about public safety, and other things like constitutional rights and the regulatory state and all of that. Secondly, they've been doing it in a political manner, and that's completely improper. So, for example, in 2006, there was a consumer fraud lawsuit that the Attorney General brought against Capital One. And Lori Swanson was Solicitor General under Mike Hatch at the time. And she signed a settlement agreement that directed just under $250,000 of settlement funds to Acorn. And, Acorn at that time was not exactly, they were doing some partisan type things.
Right. Very much so.
So that's really problematic.
Yeah.
And there's reason to believe that things like that have continued to go on at the Attorney General's office.
Sure.
So you have the political motivations and the political things they're doing with the consumer fraud statutes, and then the fact that they're just focusing entirely on those. So that's very problematic. But yes, there is a role for the Attorney General. We need to be enforcing our consumer fraud statutes, but not to the exclusion of everything else and not in a political way.
Very well said. Let's talk to Aaron, who's on the road giving us a call. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Appreciate that.
Okay. Well, I guess I don't know if an AG can. I've talked to the Attorney General's office about this a few times. I have a debt collector that's come after me after the first debt collector actually dismissed it. They dismissed it in a certain way that it still could be bought by another debt buyer. I'm also disabled, and and that's why it got dismissed by the first debt buyer. They were unable to. They didn't want to work with me. I ended up going into the hospital a few times, and they ended up throwing a judgment on me. And I can't remember if I was in the hospital when they actually did it, so I actually missed the court date. And I've tried working with them, and they've just been real jerks, actually, about the whole thing. And I'm just wondering, what are some of my options? I've heard something about vacating the debt and stuff like that, but they really can't do anything to me except for just screw with my credit life, I guess.
I appreciate the call, Aaron. Thanks for the question. I get the sense from that, and I imagine you get those types of questions all the time.
Yes. That
it's kind of like when you show up to a dinner and you say you're a doctor, and everybody starts asking you about your specific medical problems. Yeah. Is something a specific legal situation like that something that the Attorney General even deals with?
Well, it depends on what kind of statutes and rules impact the issue that you're talking about. And I wasn't able to get from the caller enough facts to really be able to determine what's really going on there. But the attorney, you would hope that the Attorney General's office would at least talk to whoever's coming in and give them some time and see if there are issues there where there have been, statutory violations, violations of statutes that the Attorney General actually is supposed to enforce, and take time to look into that in a non-political way and just evaluate the case and see if that's the case. And if it's not, it sounds to me like the gentleman on the phone should consult a private attorney,
Right.
and talk to them about their options.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of like, and I don't know how clean of an analogy this is, but going to the Surgeon General of the United States and asking about your specific medical issue. There are things that position administrates that are at a higher level than the specifics of an individual case. Very much appreciate having you in with us tonight. Doug Wardlow, again, running for Attorney General here in the state of Minnesota, seeking the Republican endorsement. You can find out more about his campaign at DougWardlowAG.com. It's been great having you with us. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you so much, Walter. It's been fantastic.
Stick with us. We are here 9 to 11.